hoor jy die magtige trene. Oor die veld kom dit wyd gesmeer. Die lied van 'n volk se ontwaking, wat harte sidder en beet.
Ek smoeg vir die vrese waarmee ons moet lewe, vir guns en vir moord en vir ryp. Ek smoeg vir die bad news, vir Zuma en sy views, van ons op TV moet kyk. Ek wil nie meer hoor hoe ons tieners begrawe, oor niemand hul steur aan die wet. Ek wil nie meer lees van affirmative action, of beklei om te hou wat ek het. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gein, 'n Koos Du Plessis en 'n Delary, wat liedjies sing en skryf en stry oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Ek soek vir
Welcome to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karen Smith. Please remember that we are totally listener supported, and in order to keep bringing you these programs that you love, we need some input from you. So hurry over to our shop, grab yourself some goodies, or donate the best amount that you can in order for us to be able to keep bringing you the news that the mainstream media will not. Tonight, my guest is Schalk van der Merwe, out of South Africa. He's a lawyer, for which we forgive him. He founded his own labor and business consultancy. He was the equivalent of a district attorney in South Africa, and he now has a private consulting business. He's always been politically active and has always been willing to take a stand when his country and his people were being prejudiced. Due to popular demand, and because of the many questions that we have been asked, tonight we are going to start at the very beginning and bring you as much of the history of South Africa as time allows. Schalk is very well versed in the history of South Africa and can answer just about any question that is thrown at him. So he's the ideal guest to have to tell you about this. Good evening, Schalk.
Good evening, Karen, and thank you very much for having me.
It's very, very early on Sunday morning for you there, so thank you very much for taking the time, getting out of bed, and doing this for us. Schalk, there are many, many, many misconceptions about South Africa. The biggest one is that the whites stole the land from the blacks. So I would very much like you to go back to 1625, with the landing of Jan van Riebeeck, who is today blamed by the ANC for everything that is wrong in South Africa, and just tell us a little bit about the beginnings of the once great country of South Africa.
It will definitely be my pleasure to do that for you, Karen. And yes, it's very early Sunday morning here, so lots of coffee flowing here to keep me awake. But yeah, let's start from the beginning. I think that's the best point to start. 1652, you basically had the Dutch East India Company. It was a trading company from Europe, and they decided to settle what was at that stage called the Cape of Storms. It was later renamed the Cape of Good Hope, and they decided basically to settle that area in Africa, the southern tip of Africa, for them to be able to have a trade route around Africa to the East Indias. And that is where the concept of settlement of South Africa really started. Earlier years, nearly 200 years before that, the Portuguese indeed also rounded the Cape, but they never settled the Cape and established a colony there. But 1652, indeed, Jan van Riebeeck, he was a tradesperson, a tradesman, and the administrator in the East India Company. He came to South Africa. He brought a whole host of people with him, shipbuilders and tradespeople themselves, even farmers, mercenaries, and they established a small colony at the southern point of Africa, from which grew the great nation of South Africa. And you're quite right. When Van Riebeeck landed in the Cape, to all intents and purposes, there were no black people in what is today South Africa. Most of them were still moving in from the north, from Central Africa. They were moving into the north of what is now South Africa. So it was definitely not a black country per se when Van Riebeeck landed in 1652.
No, as I understand it, the only people that were found at the Cape by both the Portuguese and by Jan van Riebeeck were the Khoi.
Yes. And now for you American listeners, there's a vast difference between the black people who's mostly from the Bantu background and what is a much smaller race of brown people, the Khoi people and the San people. Now these days collectively they are known as the Khoisan people. The Khoi people were more the herders and they had animals that they looked after, whereas the San people were more nomadic. They were basically hunters. But these days, it's called collectively the Khoisan people. They are not black people. They are definitely not black. They are much lighter skinned. Their culture is totally different. Their language is totally different. And they live scattered throughout what is today called the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape and Northern Cape. They basically lived in that area, but not as a culture or civilization or a country. It was basically nomadic people scattered all over the face of South Africa. The Bantu people, the first time that Europeans actually came into contact with the Bantu people was quite a bit later, about 200 years after that, where you found the trek boers, the white trek boers, going into the interior of South Africa and eventually landing up on the Fish River in the Eastern Cape, where they for the first time encountered the Xhosa people who were moving in from the north. And that, of course, caused numerous border wars through the years. Later on, even the English, British colonial government fought these wars against the Xhosa people. So in other words, the western half of South Africa was never at any point settled by black people before the white colonists came into those areas.
No, but we really need to go into how why the Boers left, and also the changing of the Cape, but between the Dutch and the British and back to the Dutch again, and we need to describe that because it is relevant to what happened in South Africa later on.
Yes, that's indeed so. So let me describe it to you in this way. When the Dutch landed, the objective was simply to have a midway trading type of post. They planted a few gardens for the Dutch ships to take on fruit and vegetables at the Cape. So the intention of the Dutch East India Company was never to conquer Africa or to conquer like the British later on, centuries after that. They built an empire in Africa. It was basically a trading post. But very soon after the Dutch founded the colony there, many of the Dutch people decided that the Cape was a very inherently fertile land, that the climate was good, etc. So they decided that they want to settle, and they started to move out of the colony, the small little colony there in what is today Cape Town, and they started to settle further on into the Drakensberg Mountains and in the area around Cape Town. And very soon after that, they actually went to the Dutch East India Company, and they told the company, but they did not want to work for the company anymore. They wanted to be free and simply to farm the land there as citizens. Now, in Afrikaans, there's a word called vryburger, which literally means free citizen. And that is what these first Afrikaners, if you want to call them. Of course, at that point in time, they didn't call themselves Afrikaners. They were still Dutch people. That is where the vryburgers, the free burgers, for the first time, then established themselves outside the colony, the physical colony of the Cape. Through the years, you also then saw an influx of all different kinds of European settlers from Germany and from the other parts of the Netherlands, from Denmark, from all the Scandinavian countries. And then, of course, also in 1685 and onwards, you had a stream of immigrants from France, the French Huguenots, who were religiously persecuted in France. They started to settle also in the Cape. So steadily, the number of people living in the Cape, the population started to rise. And of course, it meant that the borders around the colony started to expand. Later on, even you had quite a bit of disagreement between the Dutch colonial, the old company, Dutch East India Company, ruling and governing the Cape, and these free burgers. And you had them starting to move into the vast interior, out of the Cape area, which is mostly winelands and fruit and vegetables being grown there, into the vast interior beyond that, where you basically had farming with animals, stock farming, cattle and sheep and these things. So that meant that the original people living in the Cape started to move all the way further to the east and further to the north, and the colony started to expand way beyond what the British ever, the Dutch ever wanted. But now you must remember something. In these years, there was also a lot of turmoil in Europe. Everything from the 7 Years' War, where the Prussians basically took on the whole of Europe. And from that, it escalated. Later on, you had the French Revolution, and you had the Napoleonic Wars. And because the Cape is this strategic outpost that basically is midway between Europe, if you sail around Africa, between Europe and the East Indies, where the great trading posts of the European colonies at that point in time was, you had that the British, with their great naval entity, they wanted to take over the Cape for strategic purposes during the Napoleonic Wars. And that is why the British, for the first time, came and they colonized, they took over the Cape from the Dutch. Very shortly after that, during a lull in the fighting of the Napoleonic Wars, you had the British even giving the Cape back to the Dutch and saying to them, we don't want this outpost. You can govern it again. But unfortunately, the Dutch sided with the French, and then once again you had the British taking over the Cape. It was in 1812, if I'm not mistaken, and from there on, the old Dutch colony became a British colony by force. And from that, a huge amount of turmoil and conflict started to stem, which would have gone then on for 2 centuries after that.
And was that when the Great Trek began? Because the Afrikaners did not like this more liberal side that the British brought with them.
Yeah, that preceded the Great Trek with a few decades, not a few centuries. So basically what happened was that the new colonial rule of the British came in. And the Dutch settlers, let's call them Afrikaners or Proto-Afrikaners, whatever you want to call them at that stage, they felt threatened by the English. The English tried to change the whole political structure of South Africa. They tried to change the whole legal system of South Africa. Religion, which is very close to the heart of the Dutch people or the people at that stage living in South Africa. I mean, they came from Europe. The French settlers, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, came from Europe because they were religiously persecuted. And now, all of a sudden, a few generations on, they are facing the British, who once again wants to change their religion and the way that they go to church and even the language that is used in church, etc. So you at all these conflicts. And the British trying to enforce their way of life on the Dutch settlers, the Afrikaners there in the Cape. And at one stage you had, and this actually was the little spark that ignited the whole thing, the so-called Slagternek, literally meaning the slaughter's neck incident, where the British colonial government came into a clash with 2 or 3 or 5 trekboers. And they tried to hang these trekboers for criminal reasons. There were criminal charges against them, which they were found guilty. But the long and the short is that when these people were hanged, the nooses literally broke off. And this was a sign to the colonists that God didn't want these people to die. But the British, once again, the next day they hanged the people. So that preceded the Great Trek with about 15 years. And from there on, as I said, it was like the ignition spark to this whole conflict between the Brits and the Boers, the Afrikaner people that led then for years and nearly 150 years onward from them to still have conflict. So by the 1830s, you had a lot of discontent from especially the trekboers, the Afrikaner people, the Dutch people living on the interior, and especially on the east, the east border. Now, why the east border? Because I already mentioned that previously when the colonists the first time started to encounter the Xhosa people, that was in that area. So during the years of the British rule, for instance, in 1820, they tried to bolster the border there, the area, and they bring in a lot of British settlers, and that even becomes a bigger burden on the existing Dutch settlers there, because there's a whole new type of person now living side by side with them. The British even went so far as to stop slavery. Now, it was never a situation like you had in America, where a lot of slaves came in from the West Africa and such. At the Cape, it was basically Malay slaves living with the Boer, the Dutch families. And then the British came and they abolished the slavery without any compensation to the slave owners at that stage. So that also aggravated the whole thing. So by the early 1830s, a huge number of the Dutch, the Afrikaner people, came to the realization that they could not live under British rule anymore. And we spoke about this at another point in time, Karen. You will find this golden thread running through the whole Afrikaner history of where they encounter problems from other nations, people trying to enforce them on the Afrikaner people. At first, the Afrikaners won't fight. They will try to resolve it peacefully. And how did they try to resolve it at that stage? They started to move even further into the interior, to what is now called the Great Trek. So about 14,000 people simply packed up their livelihood. They packed it on ox wagons, and they started to move up north and up east, away from the British, trying to get away and simply be free and to govern themselves. And that is where the Great Trek came from. But once again, let's emphasize they were moving into basically empty interior, because we can focus on the what is called the Defekan and Mefekan. That's two stages in the Black history of South Africa. They were moving into open interior of South Africa.
We need to also just draw the parallels here for Americans, that the Great Trek, the trekkers were exactly the same as the covered wagons that they used here when the Americans started going west. Yes. We just pulled ours with oxen, and so they were called ox wagons. Here they were called, I forget now, I can't remember the name for them, but they were the same thing, the exact same covered wagon, which you loaded to the gills. I mean, it was absolutely full with stuff hanging on the outside as well, because that was your entire worldly goods that you were taking with you to start a new life. So the parallels are perfect with what happened in America.
Yes, definitely. In America, you also had a lot of political and economic pressure that caused people to start to move west, and that was basically the same as what you had in South Africa. And you can draw the parallels, the classic picture that you would have in your mind of the settler family with their wagon moving into the wild interior. That's basically what also happened in South Africa. In Northern America, of course, the white colonists encountered the American Indians, what was called at that stage American Indians, the indigenous people living in the interior of the American North America. And in South Africa, eventually, the trekkers also started to engage other black tribes, the Zulu people, the Mzilikazi people, who were actually also Zulus. These days they are seen as a different nation. So they started to encounter these scattered groups in the interior of South Africa. But I want to return to that to explain to the American listener why I say that basically the interior of South Africa was virgin land, was empty, preceding and totally without any relation to what was happening at the Cape and the expansion of the white colonists into the interior up to the 1830s or so. On the other half of South Africa, the more eastern half, and especially even more east than the Drakensberg, the great range of mountains on the eastern side of South Africa. You had a huge time of eruption between the black tribes there. You had the Zulu king, the very well-known Zulu king, Shaka Zulu, and he was literally nation building, empire building. But part of his empire building was to literally destroy everything around him. What he could not control, he basically tried to destroy, and that disrupted and it put huge pressure on all the black tribes living alongside what later became Zululand. And they started to move.
Can I just ask you a quick question here? Were they actually a Zulu tribe at that stage? Because as I understand it, as they swept further south, they were actually not the Zulu nation at that time. They were an amalgamation of all the other tribes that they'd annihilated and taken over along the way. Or am I wrong with that?
No, you're absolutely right. You must remember what is today called the Great Zulu Nation that basically lives for the most part in the northern parts of Natal and through economic migration in the provinces of Gauteng and these days even in the Western Cape. That was not a nation per se until about the 1820s. You had this influx of Bantu people from the north, and many of those people belonged to a cultural group called the Nguni people. Now, the Nguni people today are, for instance, the Xhosa people, it's the Tembu people, who lives more to the south, and then to the north you have the Zulu people. But you must remember something, that Shaka Zulu himself, he was not even the king of any of the tribes. He was an illegitimate son of one of the kings in one of the very small tribes. And then through his life, he started to build the small tribe, but later on they started to take over other tribes, and eventually it became a nation on its own, a kingship or an empire, if you want to call it like that. But it's not like that. It was always a great nation. Even today, it's called the Amakosi. Now, the Amakosi is basically a lot of tribe leaders inside the Zulu nation, still running these big clans. The Ndwandes and all these people. President Zuma, for instance, he is also of a royal bloodline somewhere. So you have this amalgamation of tribes that later on became the Zulu nation. So we mustn't have the idea like in America you had the Sioux Indians or the Cherokee Indians. It was a nation on their own. That's definitely not what happened. It was basically an empire building exercise within a space of 10 to 15 years in which Shaka Zulu amalgamated a lot of tribes under himself.
And on the way to doing that, Skull, the Defacani, he wiped out hundreds of thousands of other tribes.
Yes.
It was an enormous across Africa genocide, literally.
Yes, he genocided. That's basically what happened. What he could not control, he destroyed. So you would find the classic kingdom of the Zulus to the northern part of the Umzimvubu River in Natal. And between that area and where the Xhosa people were living, he literally created a no man's land, a buffer of hundreds of kilometers to the south that he kept open as a buffer to stop the Xhosa people from once again moving north. To his west, I described it as the eastern side of South Africa, but there's the coastline also. So to his west, there were the great range of mountains that's today called the Drakensberg Mountains.
The Dragon.
So that's
yep.
Yeah, that basically formed his borders at that on that side. To the north, it was the areas that's the very tropical areas of what is today Mozambique and Swaziland, and of course things like malaria and such. Caused that to be very not easy to populate, and that became his northern border.
And
but
the tsetse fly, Skulk, the
tsetse fly killing the Yes, the tsetse fly. You must remember malaria. It's an illness that comes from mosquitoes, and it basically affects human beings. But the tsetse fly is something different than a mosquito that affects your cattle, for instance. So you can't farm in those areas because the tsetse fly will kill all your animals. So in his attempt to create this empire, he actually caused, number one, you're quite right, a huge genocide. But before this genocide, basically everything and everybody was pushed into different directions, and that became what is on one side called the Defacani and on the other side the Meficani, in which you literally had a situation where many of these tribes became cannibals because they didn't have any other livelihood. And they killed one another in the tens, if not the hundreds of thousands. And they basically wiped themselves out in a continuous strain of war lasting over decades. Before the Voortrekkers started to arrive in the interior and actually brought stabilization to the interior to stop the Defacani. I have a theory that if the Voortrekkers didn't move into the interior of South Africa, you would have had a total wipe out of the black population in most areas outside of Natal, because that was basically what was going on. They killed one another, and of course they died of hunger. So if the Voortrekkers didn't move into those areas, most probably it would have continued until such time that nobody was basically left, or everybody started to move out to what is today called Botswana or Zimbabwe or those areas.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is a very unknown period of African history, because the Africans do not have a written history. And so on. People don't know that in the formation of the Zulu tribe and Zulu kingdom, it was a murderous bunch. So by the time they met up with the Trek Boers, they were revved up to kill everything that came in their path.
Yes, that's indeed so. So let's get back to the Voortrekkers now. So now the Voortrekkers in the Eastern Cape, or the Trek Boers in the Eastern Cape, they've become very discontented with British rule, and they start to pack up their stuff on these ox wagons, and they start to move east and north, and eventually they actually cross the Drakensberg. They cross the Drakensberg and they start moving into Natal. And for the first time, they come into contact with the Zulu people, this empire. But now, in the meantime, Shaka Zulu has died now. He died at the hands of his own brother, It was like this Julius Caesar type of situation where everybody ganged up against Shaka Zulu eventually, and they killed him, and the kingdom was taken over by his brother Dingaan. So he was the new king, and at that stage, as I said, the Voortrekkers started moving into Natal. Now we can go into a very detailed history of the relations in that time. But what basically happened was that the Voortrekkers went to the Zulus, and they said to the Zulu people, this area that is now basically no man's land, running from the Drakensberg to the west, to the east coast. We want to buy that area. Literally, we want to buy it. We want to make a settlement with you. We want to make a treaty with you. We want to come and live there in peace. We don't want to harm your kingdom. We don't want a part of the Zulu kingdom. We want a no man's land. And initially, Dingaan, he concurred with that. He wanted these trekkers to start moving into that area because it was a buffer between him and the Xhosa people much to the south. But I think Dingaan also realized that at one stage the British would come. So I think it was basically from his side also a strategic means of keeping the British out and rather have the Voortrekkers moving in, who seemed to be much more peaceful than the British. He went back on his word. Many of the American listeners will maybe know of Piet Retief, that the great Voortrekker leader. In the end, Retief was murdered by Dingaan, and then a murderous era kicked in, where the Zulu people tried to simply wipe out the Voortrekkers who were already in Natal, which ended up in the end in the Great Battle of Blood River, where the Zulu people the Zulu armies were simply stopped in their tracks and basically wiped out, which stopped that Great War. And after that, the Voortrekkers then took the land that they wanted originally, and they created the first Boer Republic called the Republic of Natalia, which they formed there.
Okay, so now we have some Trek was living in Natal. They have not yet moved any further than that because they then didn't like the British again and moved to the Free State and the Transvaal. Is that correct?
Yeah, you must remember that the Voortrekkers formed different groups. Some of them started to move into Natal. Some of them started to go out even further to the north, what is today the northern parts of South Africa. Some of them even ended up as far as Lourenço Marques, which at that point in time was Portuguese area. It's now Mozambique. So you had basically more than one grouping of Voortrekkers, of these trek boers, moving all the way. And some of them actually then established the Republic of Natalia, and very shortly the history of that, the British came, and they simply by means of war and intimidation, they simply took over that area and they established a colony in Natal. And once again, the Voortrekkers were faced with this problem of the British coming in and taking their land. And many of them then once again started to move north in Natal, or simply back over the Drakensberg into what was later called the Free State Republic. It was at that stage, it was the Winburg and the Potchefstroom republics. So they started to move back into the interior to join up with the bigger factions of Voortrekkers already settling then in the interior. Some of the Voortrekkers moved to the north of Natal, where once again they made treaties with the Zulu king at that stage. It was Mpande, and they created what was called the New Republic, the Nuwe Republiek, that later on became part of the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, which was the big Transvaal Republic that came into being. So you always see the Afrikaner people trying to be the peaceful one, rather trying to settle and make a treaty, rather moving out of the way when the British or the Zulu or whoever tries to threaten them. And every time they are caught, it's basically these groups catching up with the Afrikaner people, with the Boer people, and once again forcing them into war and disarray and moving further out north. That's basically what's going on throughout the whole of the 19th century.
Yes. So, okay, so now we the Voortrekkers in Natal didn't like the British, and they moved again. So now we formed our own two little, or was at this stage still not the two Boer republics.
We can start to at that stage to look at what later on became the two classic Boer republics, the Republic of the Free State. I'm also a Free State. I'm living in the old area of the Free State, and then a little bit further on, beyond the Great Vaal River and south to the Limpopo River, you had the formation then of what was later on called the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, the South African Republic. So those two became the big amalgamations of all the scattered Voortrekker groupings and smaller republics and all these. It later on amalgamated into those two big republics. And there were even attempts at some stage to amalgamate those two big ones into a larger Boer republic, but it didn't succeed. But that's in the mind when you speak of the Boer republics. That is what comes to mind. It's basically the Free State Republic to the south, and the Transvaal, the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek to the north, and those were proper states. The American listener must understand that they were internationally recognized states.
Yes.
It was the same as Germany or England or whatever, Britain, France. It were recognized states with a proper government, democratic government, president. Creer, for instance, being the best example that I can point out to the American listener, ruling the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek to the south. You had the great presidents like Ryds and Brandt and these presidents ruling the Afrikaners in total peace. Something that people must remember. The republics of the Free State and the Transvaal never even had a standing army. The concept of a standing army was totally foreign to the Boer people, to the Afrikaner people. We don't have armies. We only go to war to defend ourselves. Then we go on commando and we go and fight wherever the enemy is coming from. But those Boer republics, they didn't even have standing armies. They had small artillery corps and state police, but they didn't have standing armies. That was how peaceful these people tried to live. Simply out of the way of the British, out of the way of the black tribes in some areas. And that is why they established these republics to rule themselves.
But they were very rural communities, weren't they, Schalk? I mean, the Boers have traditionally been farmers. That's why they're called the Boers, actually.
Yes.
And so they didn't have huge big cities. They were very, very agricultural people.
Yes. It's very interesting to note the name Boer. Now for the English speaking person, Boer maybe relates to something boorish, is uncivilized or poor or whatever. But the name Boer is simply the old Dutch and later on Afrikaans term for farmer. It simply means farmer. So these people were called Boers, Trek Boere, Voortrekkers, and later on the Boer republics, because they were basically farmers. They were rural people. They didn't live in big cities. They went and they started to homestead. The Americans speak about homesteading. That's basically what the Voortrekkers did, the Boers. They homesteaded. They built their farms and they simply farmed there. All that they wanted was peace. All they wanted was to have peace and freedom on their own land, and raise their families and raise their crops, and that is why you basically had the people running away from everything that was foreign to them and threatened them. They simply wanted peace. You're quite right about cities. Even the greater towns in the old Boer republics were at the start mostly trading posts. They were not big cities and big towns. It was simply where people came together to trade. And of course, the Afrikaner people has this great institution that's called Nagmaal. It's a church function where in the olden days, every month or every 2 or 3 months, people will come from all the farms and they will have this big church event and they will pray together, and then they will. It is a religious affair, but they will also then trade, and the families come together and all these things. So that was basically the purposes of the towns, were more trade and nagmaal and all these things as church meetings and places of a church, than you had big cities like in Europe or North America.
Yes. And Nagmaal was quite a huge social event. People came from their farms for miles, and all the marriages and baptisms and everything all took place while there was a visiting preacher to do those things.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what happened. Everything happened during Nagmaal. They spoke politics, and they spoke church, and all the things that Afrikaners love to speak about, and everybody got married, and all the adoption, what do you call it?
Baptism.
The baptisms, the doop of the children, everything took place during those weekends of Nagmaal and those weeks of Nagmaal. So that was the great coming together of the people, of the folk, to once again feel attached to everybody, the family members and the friends and so forth. So yeah, that was centrally part of the culture and the religion of the Boer people, the Afrikaner people.
Right. So now, where does the Battle of Blood River fit into that history you've just described?
Okay, let me put it into context. Remember what I said. We started with a small colony in Cape Town. Later on, it became bigger because of the Vryburgers, the Freeburgers. Then the Trekboers went even further into the interior. They encountered the black tribes in the Eastern Cape on the Fish River and the Kai River. The British came and they took over the colony, and then the Great Trek started. And as I outlined, some of these trekkers even ended up in Natal. And after the killing of Retief, Piet Retief, they were basically at war with the Zulus, the Voortrekkers and the Zulus. So in 1838, on the banks of what is today called the Blood River, the Vegcommando under the great commander Pretorius, they were about 350 people in that commando. It was once again not a standing army by any means. They had one cannon called Griekie. They tracked a laar. Now, a lager is basically a band of wagons put into a circle.
Yeah.
Yes, they circled the wagons, and that became like a little fortress for them to fight from. The Zulus opposing them. Some numbers say that they were about 12,000. There's numbers saying up to 50,000 Zulus then came to attack the Boer laar standing on the river, on the side of the river, and in a day-long battle, they simply wiped out these Voortrekkers, these commandos. They simply wiped out most of the Zulu army. From there, the name of Blood River, because the river itself turned red because of the blood. Now you must remember, we speak now of 1838. We're not speaking of automatic rifles. We don't speak of machine guns. We're speaking of what was called by the Voortrekkers the voorlaaier. It's not even a breech loading rifle at that stage. It's a simple musket being fired by a clip from the back. One shot at a time. And that is what the Voortrekkers fought with. And as I said, they one little small cannon called Griekie, which they basically use as a big shotgun. They put shot in there, small shot, and they basically blasted into the ranks of the Zulus, very closely massed, and that caused havoc amongst them. Later on during the day of Blood River, when it became clear to the Voortrekkers that the Zulus could not breach their defenses, they simply rode out with their horses, and they basically wiped everything in front of them. And the Zulus by the evening, they took flight, and they basically ran back into Zululand. And from there on, the Vegcommando and other commandos simply went after them, and eventually a peace settlement was negotiated with the Zulus. So Blood River became this iconic battle of a small band of Voortrekkers, 300 400 men fighting this huge army of Zulu regulars, and winning them And in that, I think we saw the beginning, the seedling of the Boer and Afrikaner nationalism that was to dominate the next century, the 20th century in South Africa.
Because that battle, they prayed 5 days full on before the battle happened, and we still talk about the God of Blood River to this day, because they made a pact that they would commemorate this day forever.
Yes, that's indeed so. That's indeed so, yeah. Before the battle itself, you're quite right, for 5 days on end, they had prayer meetings where the voortrekkers asked God, if you give victory to us and save us from the Zulus, because remember before Blood River, you had this warring now between the voortrekkers and the Zulus. At Blaukrans, for instance, they came into a lager and they basically killed everybody, women and children. The Zulus they took the little children, for instance, and bashed their heads against the stones to make it as horrible as possible. Most probably to try to just simply scare the voortrekkers to go back over the mountains. So it was a very genocidal type of a situation that the voortrekkers were facing there. So they prayed to God. They said to God, if you give victory to us over the Zulus, we will do 2 things. Number one, we will build a church. Now that church is still standing where it was built by the voortrekkers. That was the first thing. But secondly, it also said that our children and their children's children will always see the day of victory as a Sabbath, as a Sunday. And to this day, the 16th of December, the day of Blood River, is seen by the Afrikaners as a holy day, as literally a Sabbath, on which the gelofte, the vow, is once again revisited, and our bands, I will say our links to our God is once again highlighted, and everybody can remember what happened at Blood River, and our God came there and literally stop the Zulus from wiping out our ancestors at Blood River.
Yes. So we've now covered most of the history up until where diamonds and gold are discovered. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the next phase. Now,
we're coming up in about 5 minutes to a station break, so we can still. Let's talk about let's lead up to the Boer War. So let's talk about the diamonds and the gold being discovered, and then after the break, we can start with the Boer Wars.
Let's do that. Yeah, throughout the last part, the second part of the 90s and 19th century, you had this discovery of diamonds in the area of Kimberley, and the British basically came and with very clever trickery, they took that area from the Free State. But the Free State once again didn't go to war. They told the British, well, if you want the diamonds, take the diamonds, but just leave us in peace. We don't want to fight you. And by treaty, that area around Kimberley became a British colony. Very shortly after that, gold was discovered at the heart of the Suid-Afrikaanse Republic on the Witwatersrand. It was inside, literally inside. It was not a situation like the British could take apart the small western part of the Free State. Gold was discovered right smack in the heart of the old ZAR, the Suid-Afrikaanse Republic, and you had a mass migration of people going into that area, a gold run like you had in California in the United States. And that caused a huge problem, because now all of a sudden the Afrikaner people were once again facing their old enemy, the British, but the British Empire, not one or two governors that wanted to take over parts of Natal. You had the Empire now viewing the diamonds and the gold of the Boer republics, and they wanted that. And that is what led up to the Boer War at the end of the century.
And as I understand it, that the British really, really needed money at that stage because of all the wars all over their empire. They needed money desperately, so they were not happy to just have taxation on it, for instance, or part of it. They wanted it all.
They wanted it all. Rhodes, the great colonial lord of Africa from Britain, he said, I want the red colonies to stretch from the Cape all the way to Cairo. And there's always this figure of Rhodes standing with his legs, the one foot on the Cape on Cape Town, the other one on Cairo. That is what the British wanted. They didn't only want to wipe out the Boer republics. They wanted the whole of Africa for themselves. And you're quite right, to basically finance all their wars. And I think everybody by the end of the 19th century realized that the Great War was brewing in Europe, and that Great War would take a lot of money. And I think that was one of the reasons why the British were looking at South Africa and the huge amounts of gold being mined there as a strategic means, if war should break out with Germany, that they could finance that. So yeah, it's very interesting to start to speculate of why the Boer War started. But you're quite right. I think number one, empire building, and number two, it was simply the British thinking strategically, filling their coffers with the gold and the diamonds coming from South Africa.
But the gold and the diamonds were in separate Boer republics, were they not?
Yes, as I outlined, the diamonds were mostly found in the western part of the Orange Free State, and by settlement, literally by settlement, the Boer Republic signed off those diamonds, those areas, the Campbell grounds and those areas. It was signed off to the British simply by saying, you can have the diamonds, we want peace. We don't want to go to war with you. But the Transvaal Republic had a much bigger problem, because the gold was literally smack in the middle of the Republic. So you couldn't cut off a part of the Transvaal and all of a sudden transfer to the British Empire. It was literally then the Transvaal realizing the British will come for it eventually, and they started to prepare for war against the British.
Wow. So the common thread through all of this is literally the British wanting to colonize everything, and the Boers simply wanting a small piece of land for themselves where they could be farmers and rule themselves, speak their language, go to their own churches, live their own lives. It was not
Yes.
a case of even at that stage where they had their own two little republics, they were not colonizing anything. They didn't.
No, they were not colonizing. They were not
didn't want
colonizing
to rule
anything.
anybody except themselves. And even then, it was a very loose form of rule over their people.
Yes. The Volksraad being the representative body governing these little republics, usually were not even 100 people at any point in time. You would basically, they didn't even have political parties. That was one of the key features of the Boer republics. They didn't have political parties. You simply voted for the person that you thought the most able to go and represent you in the Volksraad. And the Volksraad was also not a body that sat the whole year. It was like Nagmaal. From time to time, you would travel to either Pretoria or Bloemfontein. You will have Volksraad. You will decide on the matters of state, and you will return to your farm. That was the loose type of democracy and republicanism that you encountered in the Boer republics. But I want to come back to this issue of the Boers not trying to colonize or take over other states. You will always find this key ingredient when dealing with the Boers and preceding them, the Voortrekkers, that they always wanted the peaceful route. They would always go to either the black tribes or the British and say to them, but let's make a treaty, let's make a settlement before we go to war. In the end, for instance, the South Afrikaanse Republic, the Transvaal Republic, didn't have a seaport. Of course, the Free State itself is totally landlocked. But the Transvaal had the option of using Delagoa Bay, Lorenzo Marques, which was at that stage a Portuguese colony. And they actually made a treaty with the Portuguese to build a railway from the Transvaal to the sea. So any other nation, I would imagine, would rather have gone to war, to rather take off that part of land and establish a harbour. But the Boers didn't do that. They negotiated a treaty, and they simply built their railway line with the permission of the colonial lords of that area. And that indicates to you that these people only wanted peace. They didn't want to go to war with anybody. Inside the republics, you also found black tribes living there. They were left for the most part. They were left to their own devices. They had their own governments and their own kings, and they lived in peace with the Boer republics itself. So you had a great stabilization force created by the two Boer republics. Not a warring and the colonial type of taking over of land like you had the British and even the Germans and the French in the rest of Africa.
It doesn't seem like they're going to do the ad break. Skalk, I just need to ask you, do you need to take a break? I can play some music while you take a short break, or we can just continue, whichever is better for you.
If I may, let me just quickly take a drink and then clear my throat, and then we can go on. Thank you very much, Karen.
You'll just hold on 1 second. I'll put on a piece of music, and we can then you and I both can take a short break and come back and continue. We will then continue with the Boer Wars, but I think this is a good place to take a break and just get our thoughts together for where we're going to go next, because it's a very long story, and 2 hours is never enough to cover all of it.
No, it's indeed never, but yeah, thank you very much, Karen.
Okay, hold on 1 second. This one, again, is for you, Patrick. It's your favorite singer. Sonet Bridges with My Life. Sorry, Girl Without Love. Come on now, play. It doesn't want to play.
Well, if you have technical problems, let's continue.
No.
Let's continue.
We need to take a break, so I'm quite just get on with it. There we go. Sonet Bridges. It's My Life.
So many days to laugh, no time to cry. There's never been a better gift than life, and love will live
And we're back. You're listening to Radio Free South Africa on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. This is your host, Karen Smith. And our guest tonight is Schalk van der Merwe out of South Africa. You need to remember that it is now something like 2 a.m. in South Africa. So they are incredibly good guests that will get up at that hour, drink a cup of coffee, and come on air and tell us the truth about South Africa. So I'm very proud of my South African guests, my South African friends, and I really want to thank Schalk again for getting up this early on a Sunday morning. Are you there, Schalk?
Yes, I'm there. Thank you. I'm here. Thank you, Karen. So we can proceed. And once again, it's a pleasure, and I think it's my honor also to speak with you, and to have your American listeners to have the experience. And
did I lose you? This is fairly normal with South Africa, I'm afraid. If you just hold on a moment, I will get him back on the line. South Africa has some of the worst, the absolute worst internet in the world. And if there's a drop of rain, they go off air. So I will get him back. Just hold on one moment for me. We were talking up to the break and about the history of South Africa, and we are now going to going to cover the two Boer Wars, which were wars that we fought with the British, and the horrible things that they did to the South African, to the Boers in South Africa. It was incredibly nasty what they did, and they killed off 20% of the Afrikaans people in these wars. And you will see a lot of similarities to what has happened in the USA, the fights with the British, the problems that they encountered. But I'm sorry, I'm really battling to get Schalk back. But we will get him in a moment. Just hold on. Okay, he says I can call now. I don't think he had hung up. Sorry about this, folks, but it's one of the things that you have to deal with if you want real South Africans on the show. Okay, try again. Sorry for the dead air. I'm battling to get him back. If you just give me a break here. As I said before, South Africa is very, very, very difficult. I don't think that's the right number. Hang on, guys. This is becoming a bit of a problem, but we will get him back, I promise. Here we go. With a little bit of luck, he'll be back in a second. Are you there, Schalk?
I'm here. Thank you, Karen.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Okay, Schalk. So now we're up to the beginnings of the two Boer Wars. So if you'd like to take it from there.
I will definitely do that for you. As we said in the first part of the program, we had this huge migration of black people on the one side of South Africa and white colonists on the other, and you had the establishment of the two Boer republics. Then gold was found in the Witwatersrand, which was part of the ZAR, the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, the old Transvaal. And the British were looking to take that gold and basically to destabilize the whole ZAR and take over that country. In 1896, you had Cecil John Rhodes, a very good friend and I would say second-hand man. The guy that was always doing the ugly stuff on behalf of Rhodes. In 1896, Jameson took a band of his mercenaries, and they actually invaded Transvaal. It was called the Jameson Inval, the Jameson Invasion, but the commandos very quickly took to the fields, and they stopped the Jameson Invasion at Kreersdorp. That was in 1896. Now, that was a major rupture then in the politics of South Africa, because the first time the British openly, through the roads and his private company, but openly tried to take over the big Boer Republic of the Transvaal. And from there on, President Kruger of the Transvaal, although he tried to negotiate and he tried to come to a peaceful settlement around the issue of the Uitlanders, the British living inside the Transvaal, everything started to escalate into that direction of war. And then by 1899, you had the massing of troops in South Africa, British troops, and Kruger then sent an ultimatum to the British, and it ended up in 1899 with the Transvaal and the British then going to war with one another. Very closely after that, in sympathy with the Transvaal, the Free State also then declared war on Britain, and that is what later on became to be known as the Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War. Afrikaners tend to call it the Vryheidsoorlog, die Tweede Vryheidsoorlog. Why the second, or the Tweede simply means second. Why it was called the second? Because in 1881 you already had the Transvaal trying to, in 1877 actually trying to take over the Transvaal, and by 1881 the Transvaal burghers simply ejected the British colonial rulers from Transvaal. So then the Great Boer War of 1899 started. The initial phases of this war was conventional. The Boers, the big Boer commandos, started moving westwards and eastwards, and they engaged the British regular army in Natal and to the west at Kimberley, at Magersfontein and those areas. So the first part of the war was a purely conventional affair, where two armies clashed with one another. Very quickly, because of the massive outnumbering of the British to the Boers. The Boers could at any point in time only put about 50 to 60,000 people into the field, whereas the British literally had the whole British Empire to back them up. Because of the outnumbering, after about a year and a half's fighting, the British started to overwhelm the Boers, and the conventional phase of this war came to an end. And then maybe the most terrible thing that ever happened to Southern Africa, if not Africa, started to happen because the British became frustrated as they could not defeat the Boers outright on the field. The Boers started using guerrilla tactics.
Yes.
Small bands started to break up, and the British simply could not subdue them. And then the British started what was called for the first time scorched earth. Now, back in the Napoleonic Wars, the Russians did a very similar thing to Napoleon when he came into Russia in 1812. They also had scorched earth, where they basically destroyed everything that could assist the French armies. But they didn't make war on their own people. So this is the first time in history that one belligerent nation is now warring on the civilian population of another nation through scorched earth. And what this entailed was basically that the British came into the Boer republics, and they physically destroyed towns, farms, anything that could assist the Boer guerrillas. They simply destroyed. The women and the children.
Because
yes.
Sal, this is how I tell it. Because the Boers did not have a standing army, as you've already explained. So these were just people coming from their farms to come and fight for their country. And they didn't get paid a salary. They had to bring their horse and their musket and their food for 8 days, etc. But their supply line was every single farm in the Republic.
Yes, That's indeed so. So the conventional part of the war that I already explained about, that mostly took part outside the borders of the republics. But after about a year to a year and a half fighting, it was impossible for the Boers to simply keep on going against the vast British Empire. At that stage, there were about 350,000 British troops in South Africa, whereas the Boers, as I said, at most they could put about 50,000 burghers into the field. So the second part, the scorched earth part, was inside the borders of the old republics. In other words, the Boer armies were scattered, they were pushed back, and then the British started coming into the old Boer republics. And it was in that phase, you're quite right, what happened was every farm was basically a supply point for the Boer guerrillas. And the British very quickly realized that. And so they physically started to destroy everything. And when I say destroy, I literally mean that after the war, when some of the Burghers started to come back, they could not even locate the towns that they lived in previously. There was nothing left. Nothing. And the Boer children and the Boer women were taken to concentration camps. Even the blacks were taken to concentration camps because some of them were also seen as to be of benefit to the Boers. Some of them fought on behalf of the British, which is very, very ironic because the first proper anti-colonial war in Africa, the black people of the country fought on behalf of the colonial master. But we will get to that in a moment. So you had this terrible system of total destruction in the colonies. The republics. You also had inside the old Cape Colony, in the northern parts and the eastern parts, many of those people were still family with many of the people in the Boer republics. So when the Boer War started, you saw that Cape rebels in their thousands started to join up and go to fight with the Boers. So the British even made war on their own colonial subjects living in the northern and eastern part of the old Cape Colony. And for the Cape rebel, it was even worse because they were seen as traitors to the crown. If a Cape rebel was caught by the British Army, he was fusilated on the spot, and his family was taken away, and everything of them was destroyed. So you had this idea of Adolf Hitler creating concentration camps and mass murdering whole populations. Adolf Hitler was certainly not the first person to do that. The British were the first people to do it. The concentration camp system itself was a British invention. Now, it was not a death camp per se. The intention was maybe not to genocide the population, but it was the effect of it, because the people were put into harsh field conditions. There were no medical supplies. There were no food. They were basically left out in the open, and thousands upon thousands of poor women and children died because of this.
And there was also disease rampant in the camps. Now, it has been said, Schalk, that we have to understand that these poor British people, there was not enough food to feed the army and whatever, so how could they be expected to feed the Boers in the camp? That is one of the criticisms that I have received.
No, that's hogwash.
That's one of the things that I've been told.
Yes. Let me explain it to the listener like this. The South African War, it was called by the British, it was called the South African War, was a war fought in a totally different sphere of action, a total different theater of action than Britain itself.
Yeah.
You had this vast colonial empire. Remember that the British always boasted that the sun never sets on the British Empire.
Yeah.
They controlled about a quarter to a third of the totality of man of the population of the earth at one stage. Okay. They were warring against two little republics in South Africa with a combined population of not even 1 million people. So it's impossible to then have this argument, but the British people were suffering and therefore they couldn't look after the Boer people. That's impossible. I don't want to sound harsh again when I say this, but if a person argues like that, it's hogwash. It's simply not the truth. The British simply did not look after these women and children that were unsettled. I think maybe the strategy was that they wanted to take the children and the women, and then within 2 or 3 or 4 months you would see the end of the war. But it didn't happen like that, because the Boers were extremely resilient. The women taken to the camps would write letters to their men, to the menfolk, and tell them, don't stop making war against the British. Don't give up. Don't give up our freedom. And so what was supposed to, remember, the Boer War itself was supposed to be over by Christmas, and that is what the British boasted about. It became the longest and the most bloody war that the British fought between Napoleon and the First World War. And they didn't expect that. So now you're sitting with thousands upon thousands of Boer women and children in these camps. The war is not coming to an end. The strategy is failing. Europe is even turning against the British because of what they are doing. So what can the British do now? And they simply leave these people totally desolate and destitute on the field. And that is where the thousands upon thousands of people, simple, innocent women and children, that is where they start to die in these huge numbers. And the British don't really do anything to stop it, because maybe they saw it as an added bonus. I'm speculating now, but maybe they are seeing it as a bonus. If we can't beat them, then we simply wipe them from the face of the earth.
Yeah. And so as many as, I think it was something like 20%, it may have been more, of the Afrikaner population died in those camps.
Yeah, that's a fact. About a fifth, 20% or more of the Boer women and children died in the camps. A whole generation, more than a generation, was simply wiped out in a space of about a year in those camps. It was a terrible thing, and you must remember something now. Everybody thinks of it the war came to an end in 1902, so everything went back to normal, but it didn't.
No,
because everything was destroyed.
Yeah, those men had nothing to go back to, so they'd fought this war now, Skulk, but their wife is dead, their kids are dead, their farm doesn't exist. So it's like it is like starting from the very beginning again, but there are no women to marry and have more children, etc. It's just such an unbelievable tragedy.
Yes, Karen, it left this deep, extremely deeply embedded scar, not only on the Afrikaner people, I think on the whole of South Africa. It's this idea of this great injustice that occurred during the Boer War, and it was never really resolved. And it set the stage for 100 years after that, literally more than a century. We are still seeing the effects of it. It set the political stage for more than a century of trouble in South Africa, and animosity and racist clashes, racial clashes, and all these things. Everything came from how the British operated during the Boer War. The example was set there of genocide. Genocide, if you really wanted to be very negative about apartheid was nothing else than a British economic colonial system that was infused in South Africa. So the British are the people, and it's very easy to now shift the blame to the old colonial masters. But if you really go and analyze what happened there, it's the British Empire that caused all the trouble that we are still facing in South Africa today. But to sum up, so the Boer War started in 1899, and by 1902, peace came to South Africa again, a very uneasy peace. A treaty was signed at Vereniging, and the hostility ceased. But now you must remember, as we now said, there's this huge injustice that occurred now. Not only did the Boer people, the Afrikaners, lose their freedom, they lost literally everything, their whole livelihood. They lost family members, they lost children, they lost wives, they lost their elderly. The Boer prisoners of war, many of them were sent to Ceylon and St. Helena and all over the place, basically all over the known British Empire. You had these camps that Boer prisoners were sent, and they also died there in their hundreds. So it's this huge injustice that the Boer people are feeling at the end of the Boer War. So hostility ceased, but it's definitely not a peaceful ending to the whole thing. So by 1914, with the rebellion, it once again erupts. For the very simple reason, when the new government now in 1910, you had the old former colonies and the Boer republics, which is now also under British rule, they come together and they form the Union of South Africa. The Union government 4 years on, decide to go to war against Germany in the First World War, and the Boer, some of the Boer generals, and even some of the ordinary Boers in the veld, the Afrikaners, they are feeling, well, the German people were actually helping us in the Boer War, and now we're going to make war against them on behalf of the British. So by 1914, once again, you have this rebellion. And it's suppressed in the most horrible way by the British, and the Afrikaner governments that now run the Union of South Africa. And that very deep scar is just simply torn open again in 1914. And this now set the stage for this great animosity between the white races in South Africa, the English-speaking people on the one hand, the Afrikaans-speaking people on the other hand. And it runs for years, if not decades, before those scars are mended again.
It still exists to a certain degree today, Schalk, because we don't want to go into this, but there are still arguments about who's an Afrikaner, who's a Boer, and the English are kind of don't belong, if I can say it that way. It still exists to this day.
It still exists. Because if a person from the United States or Europe look into South Africa, they will see a white problem and a black problem. White people and black people.
Yes.
But it's certainly not as simple as that, because in the white group, you're quite right. You still have the more very conservative type of Afrikaners or Boers. They still see the British as from the devil, as evil people. So you even have it until today. It's not that very intense anymore. I still grew up with my parents and my grandparents telling me of all these terrible things that the British did. But the generations after that, it's not that intense anymore. But it's still there. It's still there.
Yes. So as you say, it left very, very deep scars on the country, which are still felt now.
Yes.
It's not. It wasn't. The war's over and it's forgotten. The repercussions are still felt today in South Africa.
Yes. And you must remember now, after 1914 and rebellion, and after the war now, you have a large mass of Afrikaners that's become destitute, the armblankes, the poor whites. Armblanke simply means poor white. And it's in these ranks of these poor whites that where nationalism, Afrikaner nationalism, is ignited the first time. Because they are thinking to themselves, we lost everything. We must now fight and give everything to get our country back from the British. And in that, you have the rise of Afrikaner nationalism. Now, to this point, the black-white relationships were simply a Voortrekker Zulu thing or a Voortrekker Ndebele thing, Matibele thing. So it was a small-scale affair for the Afrikaans part of the population with the black people. On the other side, it was the colonial masters, the Anglo-Zulu War that they fought against the Zulus and all those. So that was the feature there. But as from the early part of the 20th century, you have the steady rise of Afrikaner nationalism, which increasingly then took also a part of being a racial divisionary type of nationalism, where it's exclusive now. If you're Afrikaner, you're white. you belong to the Calvinist, one of the Calvinist sister churches, and you can trace your history back to the British people and the French people and the German people. And you have to steady rise throughout the 1920s and then into the 1930s. So by the 1930s, now you must remember this is now 100 years after the Great Trek. That also, the celebration of the centenary of the Great Trek infuses this hardline nationalist theory and ideology into the Afrikaner nation. The British on the other side, the English-speaking people, they are still in South Africa. They form part of the population. They find themselves in South Africa. But you're quite right. They are not seen as really part of the folk of the Afrikaner root. They are seen as outsiders by the Afrikaner people. By the 1940s, of course, the Second World War erupts, and you find increasingly that the Afrikaners have now become pro-Nazi and pro-German. If you go and look at organizations like the Ossewa Brandwacht, it was basically like the brown shirts. They only had grey shirts.
Yes.
So it was this mass Afrikaner movement that was basically modeled on the fascist and Nazi role there. Whereas the more English and the more liberal type of Afrikaner people, they wanted to fight against the Nazis, and they actually joined in the ranks and they fought. For instance, the first and third South African armored divisions fought under General Mark Clark when he invaded Italy. So you had this great division of, on one side, people being interned because they are pro-German. On the other side, the same population fighting against the Germans. And it once again, it's this great division between people in South Africa.
So then we come up to 1940. No, we really need to talk about 1913 and the Land Act and etc. Because what is perceived as an Afrikaner thing, this apartheid segregation in South Africa, it began in 1913. Seriously with the British,
and even before that,
yes.
you must remember when the British took over the Cape Colony, as we already stated, there was not a race issue because there were no black people in the Cape Colony. It was actually Lord Shepstone in Natal that the first time introduced the idea of segregation of races, because he was sitting with a few voortrekkers that were left there. He was sitting with his infused British subjects sitting there, and then a whole lot of Zulu people. So it was actually there in the mid 19th century, in the 1800s, that the first time you saw a legalized segregation of races, and it very, very quickly after that, it also spread to the old Cape Colony. And when the Boer republics were taken over by the British, it was simply infused there. So what was later called apartheid was never a Boer or Afrikaner invention. It was never an Afrikaner invention. It was simply the ideology, the race ideology of race patriotism that infused the whole of the British Empire. You had exactly the same system in India, where you had a higher class of British officialdom ruling over the big mass of Indian people living in the subcontinent there. So it's not Afrikaner invention. Come 1913, now you must remember that the Boer War took place. The black people mostly fought on the side of the British. So by 1913, there's a whole lot of pressure now on the British colonial government to also grant rights to the black people. And that is where the 1913 Act comes from, where the British came and they said, okay, you are now living in tribal areas. So what we will do by legislation, we will make those areas yours. It can't become white land. That is what the 1913 Land Act is. It's not people taking land away from black people. It's a law simply cementing where the black people are living, saying to them, you can live there. By law of the British colonial government, you may live there and nobody can take the land away from you. That is what the 1913 Land Act is. It's not apartheid. It's not this system of where supposedly white people go and they steal land from black people. It's the opposite. That is where the homeland system comes in,
Yes.
where the government of the old British government and later on the nationalist government recognizes the kingships and the tribal leaders and their areas. And they put it into law and they say, you can govern yourselves there. We don't want to govern you. You can govern yourselves. It's your land. That is basically what happened in 1913 and later on the nationalist government.
Yes. So now we come to 1948.
Okay. As I said, during the 1930s and then the early 1940s, you had this huge infusion of Afrikaner nationalism. Now, Afrikaners, they are more numerous than the English-speaking whites in the country. Most of the English-speaking people, they were voting for General Smuts. After the war, he fell out of favor with most of the whites in the country. But the Nationalist Party, they now have this huge flood of nationalism pushing them during the 1940s, and then by the general elections of 1948, the Nationalist Party, the National Party of the Afrikaner people, comes to power in South Africa. So the first time since the Boer War, Afrikaners are now governing South Africa through the Nationalist Party. One of the programs of the National Party is based on the segregation of the British, of giving homelands to black people and granting them self-determination. And that is what was called Grand Apartheid,
Yeah.
Giving the black tribes land so that they can rule themselves. They can live where they're living and they can rule themselves. That was basically Grand Apartheid, which was now part of the nationalist government's policies also, because they took it over from the British.
Yes. So this is now verwoed, is it not?
Not yet verwoed. Verwoed only came about 20 years later. This is Malan and Strydom and the early leaders of the Nationalist Party. So they already by 1956 you have a consolidation of all these regulations governing the racial division in South Africa that came from the British. The nationalist government simply goes and they start to codify all these things into different pieces of legislation and make it more governable. Then Dr. Verwoerd came in the late 1950s and of course into the 1960s. But you mustn't see apartheid as the key and the central part of the nationalist ideology. The nationalist ideology wasn't about apartheid and white and black. It was, we must become free of the British. And that is what Verwoerd brings to the Afrikaner.
Yes.
In 1961, we have the big referendum in South Africa, and the nationalists get the people to vote against the British Empire, and we become a republic once again. Totally free. We're not bound to the king anymore. Ne? That is basically the grand program of the nationalists to make South Africa free as a free nation, not under British colonial rule. And that is what Verwoerd brings to South Africa.
And he then was assassinated for his efforts.
Yes, eventually in 1966, he was indeed assassinated by a person called Zefandes. There's a whole lot like President Kennedy in the US. There's a whole host of conspiracy theories of why it happened and who did it and all these things. Long and short is by 1966, Mr. Verwoerd is indeed assassinated. So between the era of 1930 to about then 1970, you have this huge upheaval of Afrikaners gaining their independence back from the British and establishing the Great Republic of South Africa. Now, this is it's a separate entity. It's not even part of the Commonwealth anymore. They stepped out of the Commonwealth, and one of their policies is called apartheid. Because the first time Verwoerd came and he gave a name to the whole system. He calls it apartheid. Now, apartheid simply means separateness, separate development. The official term for apartheid in South Africa was never apartheid. It was simply separate development. And then you can put in italics of races. This is what the government, the nationalist government wanted. So inside South Africa, you had grand apartheid, which simply meant that you had white areas and then the black areas where the black people under their own kingships and their own governments ruled themselves. And then in the white areas, you had separate areas where black people lived and white people lived. And that was called smaller or minor apartheid versus the grander part relating to the homelands.
And the homelands were basically funded by the white taxpayers. We looked after them to the extent that they got roads and hospitals and schools and universities and electricity and water and all of those things.
Karen, that's a fact. You must remember that the black people, when apartheid, let's call it the apartheid era, let's take it from 1948 on. Most of the black people at that stage were still living in the rural areas, or they were working in the white areas in the mines and the white industries, white-owned industries. So basically the only tax base that the government, the nationalist government, and even the British government before them had were the white people, were white business and white salaried people. And it's from those taxes that the homelands were financed. It's from those taxes that schools and hospitals, everything, all the development was funded from the white taxpayer. And people forget that. The system is turned upside down by this narrative of apartheid, of where the black man is now being exploited as a slave by the white man. Basically, the opposite is true. The white taxpayer was enslaved by his own government to now care for this grand system of apartheid and this huge social engineering that was going on in South Africa. The white taxpayer paid for it. Yes, that's a fact.
And so they all had their own countries. And now we come to the hated pass system. That pass was basically a passport on their part. So they came from their own country into our country to work because, and we need to stress this as well, there never was a huge white population. We were always outnumbered. And we did not have enough people to do the manual labor. And at the same time, they wanted to come into our country to participate in the growth, the commercial, the money, the everything. So it was a win-win situation. They got to come into the white country and earn money to take back to their country, and we got the labor that we needed. Yes,
that's indeed what happened. Let's take an area like Bophuthatswana for instance. Now, Bophuthatswana was a number of different territories in which the Tswana people basically stayed. So the national government went and they took the old 1913 areas and they extended it. People don't realize that the nationalist government made the black areas bigger. You can go and have a look on the map and you will see exactly what I'm speaking about.
Yes.
So now the Tswana people are living in Bophuthatswana. They are at least normally ruling themselves. They have their own government. And you're quite right. The so-called pass laws now simply governs the movement of people in and out the Republic of South Africa. Here's what's always so ironic to me. The nation of Lesotho today is still a country separately and on its own. It's landlocked smack in the middle of South Africa, the small little country of Lesotho.
Yes.
The only reason why it's not part of South Africa, because when the British extracted from South Africa after 1948 and then specifically after 1961, they kept Lesotho as part of the British Empire. So for the British Empire, it's fine to have a homeland in which Sotho people live. But for the Afrikaner people, it's not fine to have a homeland where the Tswana people live, or the Xhosa people live, or the Zulu people live. Swaziland is exactly the same. Small little enclave wedged between South Africa and Mozambique. It always remained a British colony until it gained its independence. and it's still basically a British colony. So it's this huge contradiction of the British Empire doing one thing, and it's fine. Nobody has a problem with it. But the moment that the Afrikaner government after 1948 does it, it becomes a problem. It becomes a huge political problem that even causes South Africa to become the scoundrel of the world.
Yes.
But you're quite right. The hated pass laws simply regulated the flow of people in and out of the white areas of white South Africa, of the Republic itself. It's portrayed these days as once again this whole narrative of Nazism, of a person stopped in the street by these cruel-looking policemen, and he must show his identity documents, otherwise he's thrown into prison. That's not what happened. A policeman could stop you, and if you didn't have your passports with you, that could very easily have been obtained from the Department of Bantu Affairs, then the policeman would incarcerate you and simply send you back to the homeland until such time that you can come in legally. That was basically what pass laws were, but it was blown up into this huge political issue of where the government was portrayed as these fascists simply oppressing black people and stopping their free movement in the country, and it never was like that.
No, and Schalk, one of the most important things is that the black population increased by 920% in those years. Their life expectancy grew by 20 years. The birth deaths of children decreased radically. So if we white people were oppressing and killing them by the millions, how was any of that possible?
Exactly. The simple statistic that tells you that the whole narrative is upside down is simply pure population. You're quite right. In 1 century, the black population in South Africa increased not 90%, it increased 900%. It doubled, and then it doubled again, and it doubled again in a century. In a century, no other country on earth has ever experienced that growth in population outside of the US. And the US was fed by migrants from Europe and all over the world. Yes. That's the only other country that grew to that extent. But that tells you that something must have been very benevolent for the black population in South Africa to have increases like that. By the 1980s, the so-called peak of apartheid, which is the whole narrative is how negative it was, and this oppression of the black people and people being killed in the hundreds of thousands, all these things. That population was the most advanced, the best fed, and the most sophisticated population on the African continent. Now, even the Arabs in the north, in Libya and in Egypt, they did not have the standard of living of the black people in apartheid South Africa. Now, if we were oppressing black people, then how could this be? How is that possible? In the border war, and maybe we're not going to have enough time to discuss the whole issue of
back to do another show on from where we end tonight to today, because it's a huge subject.
Yeah, because in the border war that was fought against the communist forces in Angola, the majority of the South African troops were not white. They were black people. The very famous 32 Battalion was made up wholly of black people, of black combatants. They were Zulu regiments. They were colored regiments. They were San Bushman regiments. And so I can go on. So if these people are being oppressed this harshly at home, why would they then go and fight for us against the communists in Angola? It simply doesn't make sense. Look, we can never get away from the more human side. They were definitely suffering caused on a human scale because of a system like segregation or apartheid. But for the most part, on the political and economic scale, much higher than a simple human level. It was definitely not this malevolent system of slavery as the narrative has been built around it. It definitely wasn't. Medunsa, Medical University of South Africa, which was a black institution. It was built with white capital, but for black people. Medunsa was the biggest medical school, not in South Africa or in Africa, in the world. Medunsa was the biggest one in the world. The Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital was the biggest hospital in the world, built solely for the service of black people.
And it was the most sought after training hospital by doctors from all over the world, because they would encounter things there that they wouldn't find anywhere else.
Yes. The town, well, it's now a city, Soweto. Very well known. Even the American listeners will be very well versed with the name Soweto. Soweto is simply an acronym for Southwestern Townships. So what the apartheid government did was they literally created this huge black city to the southwest of Johannesburg to house the people coming in from the homelands. And if you go and drive through Soweto today, you will see it's a well-developed town. It's a well-developed city. It was literally built by the apartheid government to accommodate black people. Now, that totally contradicts this whole narrative of black people being killed in their thousands and millions and being slaves. Why would the apartheid government then go and build them a whole town? And now you must remember that is one example of what the apartheid government did. Every town in South Africa had what was called a so-called location.
Yes.
A location was simply where the black people lived, and the houses built there were built solely for the benefit of the black people. The schools were built there solely for the benefit of black people. The hospitals, all the infrastructure, everything was built for the benefit of the black population.
And the white population was taxed to death to pay for it.
Exactly.